Hey folks, the CC-40 is back on this channel and into my hands as my most recent TI-99 related obsession, with this 1983 machine being the closest thing to a handheld TI-99 that the world would ever get. A TI computer that shares a lot with the TI-99 under the hood, while being small enough to carry with you, and yet large enough that you can sort of touch type on it. If you want to hear all about the CC-40 and what it can and can't do, and why TI released it in kind of an incomplete state in '83, well, you can check out my earlier video on the subject, where I look at the build and the features and the limitations of the CC-40. But today I'm moving past those limitations, because I've got the two must-have modern CC-40 upgrades to show you here, which are going to give us a better view of what the CC-40 should have been, if it got everything it could have had from the outset. One of those things being software to use in your CC-40 cartridge port, since, like the TI-99, the CC-40 was supposed to use TI's solid-state software. But sadly, that software was either released in tiny numbers, or otherwise, sometimes, not at all. So getting all those titles onto a multicart was a top priority. And I'm happy to say we've now got the result of that. A multicart with all 8 of the TI cartridge titles made for CC-40 in its lifetime. And these are those 8 carts. The stars of the show being Memo Processor, which is a word processing, printing, and terminal program all in one. Then Games 1, which is a collection of classic games you can play on the CC-40. And Pascal, which lets CC-40 users write, edit, and run Pascal programs. Plus, crucially, Editor Assembler, which will let you develop programs in assembly on the CC-40 itself. Advanced electrical engineering, statistics, finance, and mathematics are the rest. And maybe those sound like a good time to you, but for me, those carts are more about expanding calculator features than computer ones, so they interest me less. Now as for the hardware here, the cart I've got I bought from Arcade Shopper, our top TI-99 community vendor, who's been building these on request. And you can see this one's got a gray case to match the body of the CC-40. As with a lot of multicarts, you make your software selections via dip switches. So I've added a label to my own cart to keep track of which switch positions I need for each title. And in this case, with switch 3 in the on position and all others down, I'm selecting the Games 1 cart. Then, with that selected, I'll plug the cart into my CC-40. With a 3D printed case on the multicart, the cartridge port cover doesn't fit over the cart anymore, like it would on a first-party cart. But since that would block your access to the dip switches on the multicart, you probably don't want that there anyway, and you'll want to just put that somewhere you won't lose it. Though otherwise, you could use the cart without its 3D printed hat if you really like that original cover. Anyway, powering on the now cart-equipped CC-40, startup takes me to TI Basic, same as always, only now I can run any program stored on the cart. So in the case of Games 1, I'll start by typing Run Contents to see what's on there. And that'll give me the names of the programs the cart adds, any of which I could run with the Run command I used to launch the menu program, but which I can also select from this listing by pressing Run here. Hunt the Wumpus is a pretty appealing option, because it doesn't get any more TI-99 than Hunt the Wumpus. And it's pretty cool the CC-40 gives us another way to die to the TI-99's most popular mascot. Which is going to happen, since this is a version of the original text-based Hunt the Wumpus, and it is a tough nut to crack. But the first step towards that is certainly reading the manual, so as to get a handle on how wumpus hunting works here. That sets the scene by saying, "The wumpus lives in a cold dark cave of 20 rooms. You are a hunter with 3 crooked arrows trying to find and shoot the wumpus." Then it goes on to explain that the cave is a collection of passages that are interconnected, but not on a simple grid. So while the caves can't be mapped out in 2 dimensions, the core gimmick is the same as you've seen on the TI-99. Where, if you're 1 room away from danger, you'll be tipped off about it. And here, that tip is just in text instead of graphics. Hunt the Wumpus was one of the first worthwhile games for the TI-99, and so it's pretty darn cool to see where it came from, and experience it on TI hardware to boot. Still, it's not the only worthwhile game on the Games 1 cart, and it's not the only one with the TI-99 connection, because Hammurabi is a classic text game you can find there too. The Oldies But Goodies 2 collection is the TI-99 tie-in for that one, since that's where it showed up first on TI hardware, back in 1980. But it makes another appearance on the CC-40 here on the Games 1 cart. In this one, the manual explains that you are Hammurabi, ruler of the ancient kingdom of Sumer. And if you can get past any angry objections that Hammurabi was Akkadian rather than Sumerian per se, well, you'll learn that as Hammurabi, you have to make decisions on how to rule your kingdom. You'll make those decisions annually over 10-year terms of office, because Sumer is a pretty forward-thinking ancient kingdom and believes in meritocratic term-limited rule, I guess. Good for it. Anyway, however you look at it, Hammurabi is a turn-based kingdom-building game where you manage your resources over time and continue to rule as long as you can. A SimCity game for the 1970s that made its way to the TI-99 and then the CC-40 in turn. And there's one more 70s classic on this cart which I think is worth talking about, going by the name Planetary Lander. In practice, a lunar lander type game where, according to the manual, you are the commander of the Antares IV spacecraft, and your mission is to safely land a team of scientists on the surface of any planet in the solar system. Though it adds, be warned that this is not merely a game, but a simulation of probable landing conditions on the various planets. So NASA seems to have said, hey, here's a spacecraft. Want to go land on a planet? And it's up to us to pick one and see if we can land there, without crashing the Antares IV. You can pick from 11 destinations, even including the Sun, which doesn't seem like a great idea, all things considered. Also doesn't seem like a planet, but, well, that still leaves 10 destinations, even including Pluto, because in 1982, that was still a planet. Then, with a destination picked, you've got to enter values to set up your approach, during which you'll control the Antares IV with the arrow keys as it tries to land. Though, because I just entered a bunch of arbitrary values, things won't work out so well, since I'm not in fact a rocket scientist. So those are the most interesting games on the Games 1 cart to me. But nice as it is, the Games cart isn't the most useful or the most interesting CC-40 cartridge TI made, with the all-around winner in those regards being Memo Processor, which did actually get a commercial release in the CC-40's lifetime. As for what the Memo Processor cart does, well, it does a few things, with this cart combining word processing, printing, and terminal features. So you can use it with the CC-40 RS-232 peripheral to communicate with another computer, or you can use it with the CC-40 modem to connect to a BBS, or you can use it with the CC-40 Printer 80 to print out your notes and documents and programs, or you can save whatever memos you write on a connected storage device. The manual has some pretty out there examples of what a fully connected CC-40 might look like in this scenario, where you've bought a little 600-gram computer for $250 just to spend $1,000 on enough expansion equipment to fill a room. But TI-99 fans are familiar with that idea after all, so I guess this spin on sidecar insanity should be appreciated for continuing the tradition. In short, Memo Processor is your general-purpose program for writing and receiving and sending and saving text on the CC-40. And while the CC-40 might not look like the world's best word processor, with its one-line screen and its tiny keyboard, well, word processors with a one-line LCD screen absolutely had their place in 1983. So with Games 1 and Memo Processor, we've now got entertainment, productivity, and connectivity covered. But a few dev tools would be nice too, wouldn't they? And the first dev tool addition to the cart library via the CC-40 multicart is Pascal. TI-99 folks had access to some pretty cool Pascal tools on that machine, since with the P-code card installed, the UCSD-P system could compile your Pascal programs to P-code, and execute them faster than TI Basic ever could. On the CC-40 though, there is a catch. Since Pascal is a structured procedural language, it's not a list of one-line instructions. So on a computer like the CC-40, where a line number driven interface is really the only thing that works, how do you write Pascal? And the answer is, with line numbers, of course. Programs in CC-40 Pascal are handled pretty much the same as they are in BASIC. You open a program with the old command, save it with the save command, list it with the list command, delete lines with the del command, and access and enter lines by line number. But at the same time, CC-40 Pascal isn't BASIC, and it doesn't do everything BASIC can do. So for example, without the call char subprogram, CC-40 Pascal can't redefine characters. And without being able to do that, you're limited to the built-in patterns. Now in the CC-40's defense, you've got 188 visible patterns available to you in ROM, which even include Japanese kana, believe it or not. So it's not just ABC123, you've got fully twice as many characters as TI-99 Basic gives you. In the end though, CC-40 Pascal is just more limited than CC-40 Basic, with no peek or poke or exec or call char or the like. So we are still on the hunt for a more powerful dev tool than Basic. And I'd say the CC-40 multicart has an answer in Editor Assembler. Not only do we have a working EA cart dump, we've got the final documentation too. Though that didn't actually make it to printing, so the typesetting is a little bit barren, as you can see. And yet, having those docs is 1,000 times better than not having them, and they really go a long way to explaining the machine. That content is pretty essential stuff, given the CC-40 is a pretty unique device. Being based around a CPU in TI's TMS 7000 series, and an operating system some whose conventions date back to the TI mini computers of the 70s. But the user manual works hard to make learning assembly for the CC-40 straightforward, while the reference manual, on the other hand, has lots of information on the CC-40 operating system and hardware. So the value the EA cart delivers is as much in the docs as the software. Especially because, unlike the TI-99, the CC-40 already gave its users ways to enter machine language instructions right out of the box. Your main tool there being the integrated debugger accessed via call debug at the system prompt. So, just imagine for a moment if the TI-99 came with that functionality on day one, instead of equation calculator being the second option on the 99.4 boot menu. Regardless, with EA you've got more than that. Just type run ALDS and the assembly language development system will come online, with 2 new options added to your toolset. And, no surprise here, an editor and assembler are your new tools. And while it might seem kind of insane to design and edit assembly programs with a line editor, it's still nice to be able to do it on the native hardware. And it does at least beat doing it in a debugger. But if you're writing programs of any kind, you're going to want to save them somewhere at some point. And that's where the CC-40 originally hit a dead end. Since with TI failing to release their wafer tape drive, there was no easy way to save anything. So that's where the HexTIr comes to save the day. The expansion solution that gives the CC-40 mass storage, but also RS-232 and a real-time clock. And it adds that in a package that doesn't really take away from the portability of the CC-40 itself. So the CC-40 won't be needing that big pile of peripherals TI envisioned. The HexTIr is usually built on an Arduino Uno in recent times, so the external connectors are mainly those of the Uno, with the exception being the HexBus connector you'll use to connect to the CC-40. As far as that HexBus connection goes, since HexBus cables are hard to come by these days, using DuPont cables connected as required is going to make sense for most people, with my cable being just 8 DuPont jumpers wrapped together at the ends. HexBus aside, the main external components in this Uno build are on the other end. With your SD slot for mass storage using a FAT32 formatted SD card, then your DC connector for power, which is regulated, so you just want something in the 7 to 12 volt range if you're using that, then USB Type-B for power or for RS-232 communication. So if you want to use that, you'll just need a USB 2.0 Type-B data cable. That RS-232 is a major bonus since, while the CC-40 did get an RS-232 peripheral back in the day, the RS-232 add-on is hopelessly rare today, so getting it essentially for free instead, as part of a storage solution, is fantastic. As far as configuration goes, HexTIr's RS-232 uses the same device number and parameters as TI's HexBus RS-232. You can open the device just like you would a file on disk, and specify bitrate and parity and everything else you might need to specify in that command. Though a nice feature here is, you can set the default connection parameters stored on the HexTIr, so you won't need to set them every time, such that you can just create a connection by opening device 20 with no extra arguments at all. And if that wasn't enough, you've also got the HexTIr's real-time clock, so you can make use of that in your programs too. Or just make yourself a clock, if you kind of lack imagination and can't think of anything to do with a clock other than display the time. But heck, on a computer like this whose battery lasts just about forever, why shouldn't it have a digital clock on screen when it isn't busy doing other things? In the end though, mass storage on modern media is what makes the HexTIr a must-have for any CC-40 user. Because now you can do the 2 things you absolutely need to be able to do to make the CC-40 a solid development platform. First of all, saving your programs and files to SD in their native format, which you can then share with other CC-40 users, or just keep around for future use. And second, listing programs to your SD card so you can quickly get plain text source for your CC-40 programs in an easy-to-share format. So if you've got a CC-40 and you're actually interested in using the thing, well, you need a HexTIr. Because even if you had every single one of the rarest CC-40 peripherals, they'd still be marginally less useful than the HexTIr is right now. And you'll probably want a multicart too, of course, because the CC-40's carts are just as rare as its peripherals. You'll want Pascal to add one more language option, and Editor Assembler to give you assembly dev tools, and Memo Processor for productivity and communication tools. Then finally, why not Games 1 for the native game library? Again, Arcade Shopper is the main vendor currently building these devices, so he's the one to talk to when it comes to picking one up. Though on the other hand, if you're adventurous or foolhardy enough, you can try building your own. Just keep in mind, the HexTIr was one person's hobby project, so don't expect professional documentation or support. We're lunatic mad scientists out here. You just have to embrace it. See you next time, folks.